Morning, everyone. We are here for the common good. It is Wednesday, and we are excited. July 28th, a lot is going on. We are getting well into the summer and thinking about what the future, our school year will look like. It's another Wednesday, Faith Wednesday, where we have joining us a good conversation from my co-host Dominique Gilliard, Laura Truex, and we also have a guest with us on this morning. I'm excited, but I'm gonna let Dominique set that interview and as well as that introduction up. Hoping that all is well in your world as you are enjoying the sun, the love, the light that is happening. And we are here again for the Common Good Faith Conversation on Wednesday. I'm going to go ahead and pass it to my co-host, Laura. Laura, how are things where you are, and how are you this morning?
Good morning, Stephanie. Good morning, everybody. Super excited to hear Melissa today. I'm Laura Truex, coming to you from Chicago, Illinois, pastor at LaSalle Street Church. It is a scorcher. We are right in the center of that heat vortex that's traveling the country right now. So I think it's 94 right now and might get up to even higher today. It's going to be crazy hot, but very happy to be here and especially grateful for this timely conversation we're going to have. So thank you. And Dominique, I'm passing it to you.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Dominique Gilliard coming to you from right in the Metro Atlanta area. And I am super excited to have this conversation with my friend Melissa this morning. We're going to be talking about her new book, How to Have an Enemy, which is just been super thought-provoking and stretching in all the good ways. The subtitle is Righteous Anger and the Work of Peace. And so, Melissa, I'm just going to invite you to kind of introduce yourself to our audience. Tell us where you're coming from and a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dive in and start to process some of this real good content you produced.
Oh, great. Thanks so much for having me on today, Dominique. And I'm coming to you from kind of down your direction, Raleigh, North Carolina, here in the land of the Kohari people who stirred this land for generations before white people arrived. So grateful to be with you, sharing in the conversation about the book. I'm a pastor, local pastor here in Raleigh in the Mennonite tradition, and been at the church I serve now for 5 years. And this congregation is just a wonderful congregation to serve, have both a very strong sense of their identity as Mennonites, a lot of people who didn't grow up Mennonite, but also how that identity doesn't make us insular, but actually puts us back into the community and helps us to develop relationships that continue to tell us who we are and to teach us about the sort of ever-evolving sense of what it means to answer the questions that are before us now. So grateful for that congregation and to be a priest among them, a priest among priests here at Raleigh Mennonite.
That's so good.
Before we actually get into the book, I'm sorry, Dominique, but
yeah, go for it.
For many people who may be watching and replay or coming on later, the Mennonite tradition is not one that comes to their mind, like at the forefront of Christian thought or spiritual practice or anything like that. And some might be like, are they like the Quakers? If they do know who Mennonites are. So can you just give us a little bit about just like who Mennonites might be? Because again, I'm sure that there are listeners out here who are like, wait a minute, I need to go look that up. I was 7 years ago before I really got into good relationship with Mennonite community in Colorado Springs. So.
Yes, you might notice I'm not wearing a bonnet. I didn't ride a buggy into I know that a lot of people sometimes Mennonite or Amish romance novels are sort of their introduction to our community, but Yeah, one thing I like to remind people is just like any tradition, there's a big spectrum of who Mennonites are. There are Hmong Mennonites, and there are Spanish-speaking Latinx congregations in Brownsville, Texas, and Garifuna congregations in Florida. And I did my internship at a historically Black Mennonite church in Philadelphia. And so Mennonites emerged in the 16th century from what we call the Radical Reformation, which is a Reformation that went perhaps a little bit further than the Reformation that we associate with people like Luther and Zwingli. And one of those, perhaps what we're best known for, is a robust commitment to peacemaking. So we're a pacifist tradition, but that pacifism is realized beyond just being against war. Pacifism is also a disposition that we take in the world that is constantly inviting us to reckon with our own participation and the principalities and powers of death that take their form in classism and racism and sexism. And so as we've grown as a tradition sort of off the farm and into other places, that tradition has developed in those ways too.
Good. I think a lot, Melissa, about the Mennonite Central Committee, because that's really been in every tradition that I know of. The MCC is often right there at the center of doing justice and reconciliation work around the world. Yes. What a great tradition you stand in. Yeah.
Thanks, Laura.
Yeah. Dominique, do you mind if I just ask a question right away?
Go for it.
Okay, I was really captivated, and I think this is a good starting place. That the way you frame your book is around waging peace, and just that verb, waging, right? Waging peace is something that we think about keeping the peace or making peace, right? But waging peace has this activism in it, and that feels like a good spot to just start. You want to kind of unpack that for us a little bit?
Sure. I do think that emerges also out of the Anabaptist tradition, where I do think that eventually we had a tradition that evolved because of very intense persecution into sort of a quietism, and I think that that's not unusual for especially the historically and traditionally white church to sort of see peace, to see pacifism as sort of that, how can we remove as much conflict from the situation as possible, right? Like, how do we smooth over these differences? How do we make the table as wide as possible?
Right.
And so both from, like, when I look back at the roots of Anabaptism, that wasn't what happened in the 16th century. It was considered like a politically dangerous movement that threatened the power of both the Lutheran and Catholic churches. It wasn't because, the proto-Mennonites like stuck to themselves and like just didn't make a fuss that they were persecuted, right? They lived out this very robust gospel that threatened the state church power around them. And I think there's something for us in that because, of course, that is how Jesus lives too. And so returning, I think, to that sort of, I think that word of waging is helpful here.
And I agree with what Laura says. It is such an active practice. Again, for those who I know in Mennonite community, it is such an engaged practice of doing the work of peace, right? Like, it is not passive. It is not just, we'll sit back. It is, how do we lift and raise our voice, insert ourselves? And this is not to paint a romantic picture of Mennonite community or anything like that, but but for those that I know, Mike Martin, Raw Tools Inc. is a ministry in Colorado. It is really about developing the plowshares for peace.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, and this, I think, has taken a turn for us as a church, for me, when you move from refusing to take on sort of the liberal separation of the personal and the political, right? That those are always intertwined. And this is really, I think, where restorative justice and transformative justice have been so important as both theological and peacemaking tools for me, because they tell us that there's that's just a false separation. Like it actually, there is nothing that is not politics, right? Like our whole life, like we are always in the process of forming a polis, like a political body that acts in the world. That's actually what the church is. And so it actually does matter, like what your relationship to ICE detention centers is. It does actually matter what your how your involvement in the city council looks around rezoning laws. Like, how can you be the good news interpersonally if the material conditions of people who we are, wanting to say, let's participate in this good news together, are unaffected by our lives?
Yeah, and that brings up for me two scenarios that you kind of address in the book that I thought were really helpful for folks who are trying to do peacemaking, reconciliation, community development. There is this tendency within a lot of these movements, particularly congregationally, to demonstrate how committed they are by holding how they're able to have people from different polarities within the same congregation, and that being a stamping validation that they're doing the work. And so you talk about a community per se that might brag about being able to have an ICE agent and an undocumented person in the same congregation, and that really validating the work of reconciliation. Talk to us a little bit about some of what we miss when we frame reconciliation in that way.
I mean, I think the most important thing that misses is a power analysis, right? We have just, as a church, we have this sort of recoiling from the language of power. And that got worked out of me early on because I started organizing with Industrial Areas Foundation. Some of you may remember Saul Alinsky, who were listening to this from the 60s, or like someone else who organized in that model, this guy named Barack Obama. And so and really what that model of organizing works around is power. Like, not that power is always at work among us. And when we first, bring up a power-based model to congregations, it's very like, oh gosh, like that's very uncomfortable to talk about power, because I think, again, we want to have this sort of reduction to sort of the stuff that kind of floats on top. Like that if we can be kind to one another, if we can hear each other's stories, if we can worship together on a daily basis, maybe something will change, but we're not really committed to that because, we all have things that we have to learn from one another. And that's really different when you're, say, in my congregation and you've actually had a church member who ended up in ICE detention. You have to decide if you're going to be for that person. Like, are we going to help them, like, visit them in Georgia? Are we going to, how does that change us? And to imagine having a congregation where some people were saying, well, he really deserved to be there. He's not really, he doesn't really deserve to be here. He broke the law, these sorts of things. Like, how do you actually have a community that acts in the world? And this is where I think I talk in the book about how the Pauline language for the body of Christ is a living being, right? Bodies act world. Paul doesn't say like, oh, you are a shovel that sits there, and like you are not a painting like that, people look at as they walk by. Like, bodies act, they do things, they move, they have a purpose, they have a direction. How are we going to have a purpose and direction if the parts of the body can't even agree who we're for, and are not willing to do what it takes to act out that good news as the body?
Yeah, so what you're saying is that, relationships aren't the silver bullet. You're not saying that they're not important, but they are not the silver bullet. Just because we can be in one room together doesn't mean the reconciliation has actually manifested itself. And I think there's another story I want to kind of just connect to that. I was in well, part of how me and Melissa got connected is through our common interest in criminal justice reform and transforming our judicial or legal system from a punitive-based system to a more restorative system. And so I was in a Facebook group with, and somebody made a comment that most of us have probably heard on some level. They were asking, is it really helpful to post pictures of law enforcement in BIPOC communities doing good? Like, is that actually really a helpful thing to post, or is that something that actually just gets used and exploited to try to decrease people's angst around some of the calls for accountability that are going on? And you have a really powerful section in the book where you talk about some of that, Melissa. So could you unpack that for us a little bit too?
Right. Yeah, I do think that there's a similar kind of I mean, in some ways, it is propaganda that happens in policing that actually mirrors this sort of sentiment of the church, that somehow, if we really just knew each other, that would be the thing to solve all of our problems. And so I tell the story about how in my city, Raleigh, we also have these events where, it's meet a cop at McDonald's and in historically Black neighborhoods, and we give you a $5 coupon or a $1 coupon for McDonald's. And we sit and we talk, and contrast that with Kenya Young sharing the story of giving her 3 sons, a Black mother, the talk, which I know that every Black person hearing this knows exactly what that is. It's the time where your parents tell you, you do not function as you're in your body in the same relationship to the police as your white peers. And so here's how you have to act to survive police encounters. And so for every time that we're having these events with the police in Southeast Raleigh, we're having Kenya Young share this talk with her child at home, basically to correct this and say, that this may have happened, but when you get pulled over at 10 p.m. because one of your headlights is out, or you have something hanging in your rearview mirror, all bets are off, right? This is, you become another Black kid, Black adult, most likely, who is threatened in the same way that all Black children who are perceived as adults are. And so I really want us to be careful about underestimating especially the power of the racial frame as we are engaging in this work in our churches. We just have to do better power analysis alongside of these questions, like whose story gets to be told, right? Whose story has the most power? How do those stories actually affect the way that we operate, or how we distribute our money? Those stories, like you said, can be powerful, but only when they're situated within our willingness to say, not everybody comes into this bearing the same power, social, economic, racial power. And so what does that mean for our common life as a people of good news?
Mhm.
Can you, Melissa, or would you speak to for our audience members, like really what this core concept is in knowing and loving one's enemy, right? Like as a person of color, a Black woman, I can say, so I went to a historically Black university. I went to Clark Atlanta University, and one of the things that was really informative in my development is the way in which we were deeply rooted in not just Black literary traditions. I was a lit major. Um, but also, canonical white literary traditions, right? We had to know whiteness in such a way in order to deal with ourselves. And that has been like the narrative of BIPOC people in the United States. But when I got to Purdue University, there's not this sense of an inverse for white people having to do this. So could you just again help our listeners understand what you are saying when you are writing about knowing and loving one's enemy, in this faith work?
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, certainly affirm that in my own experience in majority white educational settings. And this is again the great myth of whiteness and I'll just speak from theology, that there's theology and then there's Black theology, right? There's theology and then there's Mujerista theology, right? There's theology and then there's queer theology, and it's like, oh, like here's the thing against which all other things, are somehow deviant. And so for me, what I also was very important for me, because I do know that gap exists in like white people who engage in the theological traditions of womanism and Black liberation theology, was to make those people my reading partners. It's like James Cone and Dolores Williams are my thought partners in this. And I hope that, this is one of those like show and not tell. Like, wow, you get a really different kind of engagement about enemies when your primary sources and the people who help you think are people who have been who bear in their bodies the legacy of chattel slavery, of emancipating themselves from that, of the consistent and persistent refusal to continue to allow Jim Crow to set the tone for their life by taking on the Great Migration. Like, that's a different, you're hearing a different story. And when I started this book, like, I try not to write something if somebody's already written it. And it just sort of felt like, I haven't really heard people engage enemies with this particular group of people informing that conversation. And so that was for me, and why this project is significant for me in my growth and development. And I hope it is helpful for other people too.
Mhm.
And so I just want to dovetail on that. I'm gonna let you jump in a minute, Laura. Just on kind of, you talk about this kind of liturgical tradition in which congregations go to a ICE detention center as an expression of love in the framework of how we are talking about enemies, or how we're socialized to think about who our enemies are. And it's this kind of very subversive way of kind of articulating who is a part of the body and what does it mean for us to act on behalf of our sisters and brothers who are caught up in these systems and structures. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. When I lived in New Jersey and I was in seminary, there's a group that every Monday, Thursday would go to an ICE detention center. And if people aren't familiar with detention centers, they are hidden in our neighborhoods, in our, in this case, in a warehouse, like a set of warehouses, like right next to this place that held, stone for landscaping, was like this identical building that held human beings. And even that sort of image of like warehousing humans, the US government would sort of feed that out to pay people to warehouse human beings, is just such a stark contrast to sort of our belief in the sanctity of God's image in every person. And we would have this public worship of washing one another's feet in this parking lot, and share communion together. And, it's always hard to know what people inside of detention centers can hear. But, I think there was this hope that both out inside and outside, we were participating together in the same moment of Jesus' life. That these people who'd been intentionally put in this place to be forgotten and disappeared were not disappeared to us. We had made them visible in this liturgy, and that bound us to them in a different way. And so. I think there's always this very, like, I keep hearing this division, there's the pastoral and the prophetic, there's worship and activism. And these are all really false binaries that have been presented to us, that this was a moment where you could see those overcome, where the liturgical was an act of solidarity and naming and making visible those who are beloved of God, and had been imprisoned for no other reason than seeking their own safety.
That example, Melissa, reminds me of that old series by Walter Wink about around powers and principalities. I'm sure you've read it, right?
Yeah.
And and there's a scene in there where he talks about the anti-nuclear movement and how nuns and priests, primarily the Catholics were leading the way on that, would chain themselves outside of nuclear facilities. And it was a way, I think Wink describes it as a public exorcism. It was a ritualistic thing that they were doing to call attention to the evil of nuclear arms, and by chaining themselves to this fence, by the words they used and their own bodies on the line, they became these ritual sacraments of making visible the evil that nuclear arms likes to keep invisible, right?
Yeah.
Powerful examples. Can I go back to one of the guys in the chat here, Ray, said the hard work of relationships is listening. Relationships mean nothing without hard work of being a presence to build trust. And I want to go back to some of the stuff that we had heard about in the last 4 years around, I'll call them the purple churches. The churches where the pastors, were speaking across the aisle, the political aisle. And I think I started maybe 5 years ago with a purple church, and I think I've largely run the Reds out of town, and now I'm effectively pastoring largely a blue church, and I feel mixed feelings about that, in part because of what Ray's putting in the chat here, and I'm thinking like really practical. How do we listen across the aisle? I know your book addresses this, but I'd love to have you unpack this for our listeners. How do we create that common space for change to happen? Does that happen in our church? I mean, we've already kind of addressed that a little bit, that if you had an undocumented person and an ICE officer in the church, then at the minimum, what you do is unpack these power dynamics that are present, right? You have to unpack the stories of real life sorrow. You have to excavate at those kind of deep levels. But talk a little bit about those pastors who are pastoring purple churches and and trying to do that well, and in a God honoring listening hearted kind of way. I mean, what do they do?
Yeah. First of all, I don't think you need to feel bad about that, about the position that you're in. Stanley Hauerwas has this great article from a while ago in the 90s about how preaching makes enemies. And that's true. If we're going to talk about the good news of Jesus Christ, it made enemies. It will make enemies. Like that's, and I think the question is constantly for me is, what is the kind, like, what is actually church for? I think this is the question that I would really encourage everyone who is in this place of like, well, can listening change people? Okay, it sounds like what you're really in this for is to change people. And I would suggest you do an analysis of that, because evangelicals voted at even higher numbers for Trump in 2020 or in 2020 than they did in 96 in 2016. So I don't know. Right. I mean, apparently whatever you were doing didn't appear to work. But I am welcome, I'm welcome to see some different statistics on that. And so if I think that people in purple churches really believe that that's true, that if you get people, and I would love to see that that's effective. My feeling about ministry is if you keep doing something for years and years and it doesn't actually like produce the discipleship you want, you stop doing it and you do something else. And so feel free to shoot me an email if you like had people repent of Trumpism in your congregation from your purple church pastoring. I'd be happy to receive that. Which is all this to say that that is not what I think the church is for. The word that always comes to mind for me when I think about church is sanctuary. It comes from a deep commitment, again, to the tradition that I think most faithfully carried Christianity through this country, which is the Black church tradition, that left behind white spaces that were of legal white Christianity that were taught by their slave masters, and went into arbors and to the woods and created these places called hush harbors. They were places of safety and care outside of the white gaze, where they taught each other how to read, where they planned slave rebellions. And if I'm going to have a church, I want it to be a place that is sanctuary for people who their lives out there are a place of constant violence and trauma, and that this becomes a place where where their life is honored and where we can fully say, "Blessed are you," as Jesus did. That's the commitment that I have. I will not pastor unless a church. I'm very upfront about that's the kind of church I'm going to nurture. It could be that I'm just not very good at this. Like some people may skills to like talk people out of racism. I don't know how to do that. So again, if you know how to do that, I would love to know that answer as well. Like what's been effective, but I haven't found myself to be good at that.
I think that that's a really good place to even push and dig further, right? Thinking about the comment from Ray as a listener and others, the desire, the hope to build sanctuary is so critical in this transformative spiritual faith journey, right? And relationships are important when we think about the church, but there are some relationships that cannot survive in the process of this work. What do I mean by that, right? Granted, yes, we can have an ICE agent and an undocumented person in the same congregation, but at some point we are going to be buttressed up against each other, right? You can have a slave and a slave owner in the same space, but at some point somebody has to not be a slave owner if we're doing this work right. where does whiteness go in the work of sanctuary? What do we do with whiteness and those who understand themselves as white?
Yeah, and Stephanie, just to say, like, the person who's like on your team for this is Jesus, right? Who says, I will divide you from your families for the good news. Like, Jesus is like anti-family from the beginning of his ministry to the end. Where he is constantly breaking apart the expectations for even our closest relationships, that the good news will disrupt those and create something else, right? Like, I don't think it's like it's the constant sort of clearing out and building again, right? That happens with Jesus. He brings a new family to the Passover meal for the Last Supper. And so, yeah, so I think like we don't really want to deal with that. I've never heard somebody preach about that. I've never preached about that. But I do have a chapter in the book about becoming enemies to family, because Jesus is so consistent about this. Yeah, so that's a first thing. But yeah, like this, I think that's a great question because, and why I know this is another, like, I'm just going to say like all the super unpopular things on your show today. My sense about the work of majority white churches is not that the goal is to become a multiracial church. Goal of white churches is to become anti-racist churches, and to constantly be in the work of attending to our whiteness, and to figure out how we can take hold, as Willie Jennings said, of Black anger, and be sure that our Black and brown siblings do not bear that anger alone. If that eventually leads to a multiracial church, that's great. But my experience here in the South, I think hearing similar resonance to your experience at a HBCU, is that I know the power of the historically Black church to be, again, a place of sanctuary and refuge from whiteness, right? To have an educational experience where whiteness isn't the thing that you're always defining yourself against. That is liberation and healing and freedom. And so I respect that we have historically Black churches, Latina churches, because people recognize the power of those spaces. And so I think we have a different kind of journey in our majority white church of that constant work of deconstructing our whiteness, and putting ourselves into solidarity with other people in our community. And again, if eventually we become a multiracial church, and that's a vision that the church sets for itself, we can assess whether we have actually become a safe place, that we have become a sanctuary for Black and brown people.
So there's two quotes I want to lift up real quick before, and I would be remiss if we don't have time to allow you to unpack the Psalms for us and kind of what you do in the book around the Psalms. But before we get there, kind of going along with some of what you said, I really appreciated these two quotes. The first one is, "The work of pastors is not to soften strong beliefs or to shelter oppressive ideologies under the guise of our oneness in Christ. Instead, it is to work to carve out a common life within the good news of Jesus' redemption." I think that's a very different way of thinking about oneness in Christ than what a lot of our congregations across the country articulate. And so I really appreciated that. And then the second quote, their social customs. They reject participation in economies of death and refuse to steal and kill for the empire. Can you talk to us a little bit about kind of how you've gotten to come to these conclusions within your pastoral ministry and lived experience? Because I think they're really profoundly important for ministers as we lead in this moment of both sidesisms and the purple church and wanting to love our enemy in a way where it causes us to essentially overlook the harm that they're causing to our fellow sisters and brothers. And how can some of this be a corrective to some of that problematic orientation?
Yeah. I I think that something that is not taken with seriousness about I think people who really are caught in that, like both sidesism, is um, that people who are oppressors are also caught in the web of destruction and death, right? We need to save those people. Like oh gosh, I wish I could remember who I heard say this recently. It was a womanist theologian who was saying, like, do white people care so little about other white people that like you don't care that like these people are like really bound up in like these destructive patterns that are both destructive to themselves and to others? Like what I'm worried. I am worried about ICE agents. Like I cannot imagine what it does to someone's soul to have a job where you kidnap people, where you come to a house and take someone away from their screaming child. I cannot imagine what that does to your humanity. And I want people to be saved from that, which I know, we sort of get like, that may feel very arrogant, but also like this is what we do. Like we read the good news together, and we also find out that echoes back on us, right? I want to be saved from whiteness. Like I need to be redeemed from it, and so I think more than just saying like, wow, this is like really harsh. Like what we're actually offering is to disrupt the both people who are caught differently in the same web of destruction, in oppressor, right? Like that's what actually ties these two together. And I want that for myself. I want that for the church. And so, and where this comes from is just like reading a lot of Jesus, right? Like I'm kind of a biblicist. Like and when we take Jesus seriously, this isn't Jesus, prancing in a field with lambs and, just hugging children all the time. Like, man, this is a very like, this Jesus is so intense that even his followers are like, I don't know about this Jesus. Like this is people who've given up everything for him are like, I'm not sure I can go there with you yet. And Jesus is like, all right, but now and like, let's figure this life out together. Right. But they always know what, even if they can't do it yet, they have set before them life. And he is building people around them who can live that out together by the power of the Holy Spirit.
So I've been doing a deep dive recently, Melissa, around the Sermon on the Mount, and talking a lot with a friend of mine who's publishing a new book about that, Chuck Manto, and thinking about the role that forgiveness, this kind of robust, muscular forgiveness that Jesus demands of his followers, right? In fact, that's the one that's got the catch to it, forgive so that you may be forgiven, right? So can you kind of unpack that too? Because that's often not in the conversation around waging peace. Talk a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, forgiveness in the Bible is so interesting because what I love about a phrase like that is Jesus says these things, and then in the Acts and the epistles, we actually see what they do with it and how like it's really, really hard. Like when real human beings are like dealing with each other, right? And that's what I love about Acts and the epistles. It's like, okay, now it's getting real. Like this is like in the dirt now with these Jesus teachings. And, I think one of the things that we see happening there is that people they harm one another. And what the response to that harm is they actually have to change their lives, right? Like, so we think about 1 Corinthians, like all these wealthy, like leisurely class people are eating all the food before the poor working class enslaved people show up to the meal, right? And and Paul's response to that is like, y'all gotta like figure this out, like quit eating until the other people get there. What's wrong with you? And so there's this, I think we see this constant refrain in the Bible of, again, that forgiveness is attached to a communal form of life, right? I love that the Sermon on the Mount is like directed at a group of people, right? It's not like Jesus is like, all right, Peter, here's how this is going to go down. List. It's like, hey, group of the most marginalized, under the foot of Roman oppression people. Here is this like act of resistance that they cannot make sense of, they cannot thwart, they cannot that will actually also transform you. Because you're refusing to play by this game anymore of retribution and violence for violence. And we've got other work to do. So when these Roman soldiers come up to you and take your clothes away, like this is the disruption. This is the disruption that will happen. And then we continue on with the life that we are building among us. I almost feel like this is Jesus saying, like, you don't even need to bother. Like, don't put all your energy into like these resistance movements that just keep getting crushed. Build something new. Like build this world is already here. Like enter into it.
And so you talked about how kind of Jesus says on the ground, like things have to change when we're living in these kind of unjust, oppressive societies. Talk a little bit about how those living on the underside of empire pray and engage with God in the midst of injustice and oppression, and how Scripture creates a framework and space for us to do that in a very unadulterated way.
Yeah. I have a chapter devoted to Psalms that we often call imprecatory Psalms, Psalms of Retribution, which I feel like is, I understand the reason we call them that, but Psalms of rage, Psalms of cries for justice. And what and one of the things that, again, is really helpful just about like being someone who reads the Bible a lot is, for me, was discovering that Jesus prays some of these prayers that, I think we've, especially in Anabaptism, there's a pretty strong desire to say like, well, Jesus sort of fixes all of these violent things that happen in the Old Testament. And my first book was sort of wanting to disrupt that sort of idea a little bit. But I think it's fascinating to see Jesus also pray those psalms, to see those psalms emerge in the lives of the disciples and the early church, as if Jesus also takes on the role of this holy rage and justice. And those psalms, I think, can have been called ethical deformations, right? They don't appear in our lectionary. I think there's always questions from my church, even for myself. Do I pray these psalms? Do I? I thought I would just tell this story about sort of living out this sort of this imprecation. A couple years ago now, with my friend Shalise Overy, we co-led a Bible study about the idols to whiteness in our downtown area, which are Confederate monuments. And so each week we would read the story of God taking down an idol, like God's response to idolatry. And we would tell the story of that Confederate monument, again, as a trying to collapse activism and worship. But we always ended with this pretty imprecatory psalm. And I would sort of jokingly, but not really, I would just say, let's just all stand back as we circle this monument, just in case today is the day that God like strikes this monument in our midst. And I mean, I'm like, you know, I'm fine with things like that. I believe God could do that. I pray for the prison walls of NCCIW to fall literally every day. But it happened, you guys. It happened. Our Confederate monuments are gone. And it didn't happen in the way I expected.
Right.
But somehow, those words that were spoken by us, but put us in community with the people who have said those words for generations, right? Who have said, we were simply a conduit for all of those people who have said those psalms, because there is no other way out, right? Yes. And so to entrust the fullness of your rage and your anger and your desire for destruction and revenge to God, and say, I don't know what to do with this, but I know that God can handle this, and I can give this over to a God who loves me and sees me where I am. That may transform me. It may transform my anger, or it may show me that my anger is justly placed in the world and other people are drawn into that anger too. And that's certainly what it felt like for us in those moments surrounding those monuments, and praying for God to cause them to fall.
Well, Melissa, this has been a wonderful, exciting conversation, and I encourage you all who are listening, if you have not had the opportunity to read Melissa's work, that you definitely do go by her books, read her articles. Melissa, do you want to share your website, just so that people know how they can find you? Your books, I'm sure, are available on major platforms, but do you have specific platforms that you are uplifting where you would love to have people access your work?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, and pretty easy to find with my name. I have a website, melissa.florer-bixler, and just looking forward to more conversations with people, and feel like I always need to give a little shout out to contribute to the National Bail Fund. If in fact you could do that before buying the book, if you have to make a choice between $16 in one direction or the other. But grateful to spend this time with you.
Likewise. And we're grateful for all of our guests who come faithfully each week. For those who are new joining us on our Common Good Faith podcast for Wednesday, knowing that we will be back tomorrow an hour later on Thursday, but we are here every day, and we love to have you. We're on every platform, from Twitter to Twitch to Facebook and YouTube. Listen to the work of the common good.